I'm the senior editor at Design Boom New York. So I'm really happy to be moderating today. I'm so glad that and tune in for our live stream viewers. I'll begin by introducing our panelists today. We have Christian Schlinder.
Perfect.
So he's the Senior Vice President of and General Manager of Global Design at Harman, which creates technology to enrich customers' daily lives in lifestyle and professional audio, automotive brand, and technology experiences, together with digital transformational services. Next, we have Pascal Sablon. She's an architect and the CEO of Ajay Associates New York Studio. She's the global president of NOMA, which is the National Organization of Minority Architects, and she's the founder of Beyond the Built Environment, which is a platform that encourages young women and young people of color to pursue a career in architecture. And she is the 315th African-American female architect in the United States to obtain her architectural license. And so
she's also a fellow at IEIA.
So lastly, we're joined by the Managing Director of NYCxDesign USA and Global Head of Sustainability and Impact. Lisa is an expert brand builder. Adidas and Chobani, grow and transform. And in November 2022, is an interview series comprised of quick and candid conversations exploring where so with today's theme of power and place, unpack how design can create a sense of place. So it's more than just laying out a floor plan. We need disciplines at different scales. These could involve urban planning, sound, or furniture and materials. So for each discussion, I thought you might unpack what does it mean.
I'll start. Our sense of space that we create is extremely diverse. So as you were mentioning earlier, we touch every part of everybody's life. Our objective is through audio, through other pieces, into everybody's life in different parts in different ways. So space, how do we provide that? Going into your vehicle, how do we create the space inside the vehicle? When you get to where you're going, be it work, be it going to the gym, how do we bring an experience to life there? Also, usually through a lot of audio. But it's also the experiences. How are you controlling the audio? How is the audio following you, right? So we're not just dealing with the physical product that you see around. During the rest of the day, you'll end up having it in your home. You'll have it with you. You'll have it at the nightclub. You'll have it when you're going to sleep in the, working in the kitchen before you go to sleep. So for us, creating a space is the full experience that we can create in multiple form factors. They're personal, they're intimate, like on a headphone where you're in between the two pieces of technology. They're public when you're in an event space like the Madison Square Garden over here. Every part of that, we create what you want to experience. We give you the tool to make it your space for that moment, for that period, and that time, that experience.
So first question, can you all hear us okay? Because I feel like the squinting of the eyes feels different. So I'm going to just bring up my volume. All right. It's like reading the audience, and I saw a lot of
I was hoping there was a sound back there.
Yeah, the eyes were communicating so much more. Okay, so I'm going to try to maintain this volume. If I fail, just kind of like keep me honest, and I'll bring it back up. So I will say for me, the power of place is the idea of architecturalizing identity and culture. And to do that requires us to engage the community in the work that we're doing. So I understand architecture or architects as stewards, as resources to general society, to leverage, to craft, to scaffold the built environment that creates a space that supports how one lives, and what they aspire to be, and also keeps the history of what has been. So in a lot of projects in architecture, it's usually reconciling a very difficult and complex path, as well as multiple viewpoints, diverse backgrounds, and positions on a lot of different topics. And so having engagement with the audience, not just those who cut the check, although those are very nice people, but recognizing that architecture is beyond the exact client that you have, but anyone that's going to interact with the project. And also giving up that sense of control so that you're also allowing for those community members to participate in the design process, therefore creating a sense of ownership and also sharing their sense of identity, therefore architecturalizing it in the parts that we're doing. And that can be done through huge master plans efforts, but it can also be done by temporary pavilions and structures that also bring life, joy, and wellness to a lot of people. So when we talk about the power of place, it's the story that it's communicating. It's walking into a space and feeling by the colors, by the textures, by the furniture or lack thereof, whether you're welcome to be there or not. It's also understanding what it means about holding history. That history is not always beautiful. And so what does it mean about those spaces, and how do we create moments of memory that not just rehash harmful things, but talk about how healing can happen through architecture as well. So it's a sense of opportunity for me is the power of place, but it has to be this wonderful collaborative process, else it's just a sculpture that's you take it or leave it. And I think successful architecture and what a powerful place could be is one where everyone who walks in it takes away or sees themselves reflected in the space that's there.
I mean, it's a tough act to follow, Pascal. um, I think, one of the things that's interesting for me, and having created this idea of power of place, having visited Harman's headquarters here, and coming and doing a site visit of imagining you all here doing New York, City Design Week, was really important as like, well, who's on the panel first of all, and Rory was going to be here, so I'll try to speak from an interdisciplinary design perspective, which IF design, of course, represents. But I think that for me, in a very fast-moving world, which we all know, where we're disconnected more and more because of our technology, because of the devices that we're holding, because of trying to be in multiple places. To me, grounding ourselves in a place, and that place is a moment. That place is the sensory experience of whatever it is, whether we walk into a restaurant, whether we go to an event, whether we have our home and a bed. All of these things are what design solves for. So Christian's talking about how do you make it yours through sound and audio in a car, in a bedroom, or in a public, concert hall. Pascal's talking about something much more meaningful, which is big scale architecture. I'm thinking about, we have 8 too. No,
Next time. No, kidding.
but it's you have furniture designers here. We have fashion designers here. We have lighting designers here. We have interior, designers here. Interior architects. We have so many different people. We have media and brand designers. And I think the interesting thing for me about interdisciplinary design, and that's what IF design, of course, represents, 82 categories of design. And there isn't a hierarchy of what matters more or less, right? Each thing brings to it something unique. How do you curate an event with the right people? How do you curate it with the right food and beverage and weather and backgrounds, I mean, you sometimes you have to play with what's there. So I think of it as the 5 senses in power plays of like how do you aspect and bring it to life.
Yeah. I thought we discuss the balance between a place's functionality and its environmental impact. So Pascal, in the past, you've discussed how architecture can be a vessel for advocacy and for teaching history to tell the stories that are forgotten. So this certainly blends functionality and emotion. You definitely have to incorporate emotion.
Just speak up.
Okay, so you have to incorporate emotion into advocacy to help listeners empathize and understand. So what are some ways that you've seen this play out in or outside your practice?
Sure. So the way I've seen emotion kind of come through architecture, I think about my very first project that I worked on as an intern, where I worked on the African Burial Ground National Monument, which is near City Hall, where they're excavating to build a federal structure. and they started to come across African remains. And that was halted, and studies were done, and they found over 400 remains on site and 500 artifacts. And then we started to present design competitions in terms of what would be the right piece of architecture that would speak to the importance of the legacy of this particular site. And in that work, we worked with historians. And the historians actually spoke to us about the larger African burial ground in downtown Manhattan, that it was actually estimated 20,000 African remains in that area, including under the federal building to the north, the federal building to the west, City Hall, where everybody got married from. And so one could imagine that as foundations were being poured and excavations were being done for all those structures, those same remains could have been seen, and it was built on top of. So when we talk about the history of downtown Manhattan, we could literally say it was literally, physically, spiritually, conceptually built on the backs of Africans. And why I'm using the term Africans and not slaves is because we also figured out through that historian work that actually the first set of Africans in New York were not slaves. They were actually really powerful, intelligent business owners that was able to create and thrive. And it wasn't until the transatlantic slave trade that came and changed the dichotomy of what the environment is. And that also was surprising because for me, my education always started the narrative as we started in change. So any progress is one to be proud of. But in actuality, we now have this piece of architecture that speaks to that. So on the side of the ancestral chamber, there's a map that actually transcribes all those buildings and where the extent of that will be, or the burial ground actually lives, so that people understand that. And those 417 that was reinterred in the landscaping is not just kind of put a grass on top of it, but they're mounds. That when you walk through that space, you understand, and you appreciate their existence and the existence of us. And so that is to have an emotional response. This isn't the spot you go to have lunch or a first date. There's a lot of places that can do that. This isn't one of them. And the other example that I'll give you is this glorious project. It's one of my favorites. Although I'm not supposed to have favorites, but here we are anyway. Is this
You
project?
can live stream.
Keep it between us. That there's this wonderful project called Sycamore and Oak in DC, where we're looking to create this beautiful multi-program structure. And we wanted to make sure that we designed with sustainability in mind, with mass timber and all these different technologies. And we wanted to create amazing opportunities for the local businesses that are there. And so in the interim, from the time of design concepts through documentation, it takes a few years. We would love it to go faster, but it takes some time. But in that interim, what can that site be as a resource to the community? So instead, currently, it has a temporary pavilion that's on there that actually becomes incubators and for all the small businesses, where they're actually able to rally together, take classes about creating a successful business. They're creating their patronages and creating the community staple. And when the larger development comes to fruition, they already have all the tools it is to not just exist, but to thrive in that space. And even from an architectural practice with the mass timber, actually test those design details of how we put things together, so that a smaller construction company that is minority owned was able to work on it, understand the details, and have that idea. And now when the larger project comes to fruition, they also have now that expertise and is able to build their business accordingly. So I love this idea. When we talk about advocacy, we almost think it's a protest, we think it's a form, we think it's a moment to make noise, but actually architecture itself can be an advocate moment. And so I find that that's very emotional, because when I go there to see the community so excited about this space and leveraging it all sorts of times, I think, wow, this is a power of place in that capacity, but also it evokes a different kind of emotion. I gave you an example of a somber, kind of pissed off emotion, and I gave you one about aspirations and kind of exciting.
So Christian, your work is extremely technical.
Yes.
But it focuses on sound, which is perhaps one of the very emotional aspect of placemaking. So how can sound be leveraged to shift the atmosphere of a place in ways that we might not have realized?
Yeah, and allow me to make that a little bit bigger, maybe more meaningful.
Oh my words.
I know. Sound is one element. So as we also look, we are a technology company. So for us, the space that we're creating, the power of the space is bringing that technology to life. And in an automobile, we're also the company that is putting together the brains in the vehicle telling you what the car is sensing, right? So we're creating that power of the space moving safely at 60 miles an hour. So there's a big part of the sound that is so popular and so big in our culture. But in the company, I mean, financially, twice as big is actually the automotive side of the house, where the power of the space is moving you, right? So we're trying to get you from A to B in a safe way. And I love how you use the word atmospheres. We actually use them in the design process to explain to OEMs how we bring technology, how we bring brands to life in an atmosphere. Louder than that?
Louder.
Wow. I'll stop talking to you. I'll focus this way. So we bring atmosphere. So we use the word atmosphere to explain technology and the audio all together as one. So as an OEM, they don't always understand when we start talking about sensors on the front of the vehicle, ADAS to the cloud, all sorts of, how do I get you from A to B in a safe way? How do I translate that to your heads-up display? We're doing all of that. And then we also have to make sense of it's beautiful, right? So we're bringing a brand to life. Those brands have personalities. Those brands are very different inside each of those OEMs. How do we create that? We use the word atmosphere. So we create an atmosphere. It has a, a CMF, a colors, materials, and finishes palette. It has a UI palette. It has this whole expression of what am I trying to do at 60 miles an hour safely in a beautiful way? Shifting that to the power of space, when we look at Madison Square Garden, it's a very different, entertaining place to be than other parts of the city here. But it is all about, one time it's a rock concert, then it's a classical concert, then it's a basketball game. So how you design to hide something is a very different power of place. So you'll understand this from architecture. There are things you have to put in that you don't want anybody to see. It's totally backwards to the design world. You actually want to present things, your job is to bring them to life. But when life is secretly hidden in the attic, it's a very interesting conundrum as the design team. So we lean on the interface, right? How do you make it as smart as possible for the people that need to use it? So we also create the software so that when you go to Madison Square Garden and you're the sound engineer, you can hook up in 30 minutes instead of 3 days. So there's math behind that that goes to renting it out for your sound engineer and what that costs. But the experience is that artist can go in more quickly and true to who they want to be to their audience, right? At the end of the day, everything audio we do is to create something that an artist created in a controlled environment. It goes through manipulation, and it goes through fine tuning in the recording process, and then it becomes presented. Our job is to present it as authentic as possible. That's part of our power in that space. When you go home and you have a couple of speakers in your house, it's a totally different, right, engagement that you want to have. So for me, the power of space and what we do is every single space. So it is technology driven for sure, but it's also purpose driven in each of them with different pieces. And then you have different layers, and we'll call them topography, right? Different layers of what type of technology are we putting in? We call them an ADAS system, the advanced driver awareness in the vehicle, right? 99.9% of that information, none of you need to know about. But the second you start to drop your eyes a little bit, and all of a sudden it needs to tell you to wake up. That's us. That's a very power of the place. We need to keep you awake, right? So you don't miss that off ramp, or God forbid you hit something or someone, right? So technology coming together, the audio is a big piece, but it is so much more in such I don't call it a portfolio, but as designers, we tend to use that to lump together anything that we want to put together that has meaning. So it's a very broad portfolio of touch points that creates that space.
And Lisa, I'll have you jump in if you have anything you'd like to add to this.
I mean, I'm interested because at NYCxDesign, we, as I mentioned, we have 9 design categories that the award represents at least, which include architecture, interior architecture, product, and all of its list, packaging, communications, whatever. But we have UX and UI and service design as well as separate disciplines. And we just published our 3rd annual trend report, which comes out of 11,000 entries that we get every year from about 70 countries. And one of the things is really like there are key megatrends, that matter. And one of the things that I said at South by Southwest recently is this concept of and I think this is actually, Christian, what you're alluding to, is UX. You know, UI is one thing. It's very obvious. All of us have our phones, we have our apps, we have the technology that allows a sound engineer at Madison Square Garden to lock in 30 minutes versus 3 days. These are really technical solutions to, frankly, design and engineering challenges.
Yep.
And what I think is really interesting right now, and it's true increasingly, we used to call it IoT. I don't think that's an expression that's like very popular anymore, but it's really UX. UX to me is the real question that is like, what is UX on its own? It's kind of nothing. Like UX is everything. UX is all of these, we were talking about sensory pieces together. It's architecture and interiors and audio and interface and, you know, the furniture that you choose and the textures. I find more and more that UX is actually design. And so I think that's, for me, the most interesting piece of what is the power of place, is saying, well, what's actually the experience of design and all of the pieces that go into it.
I would love to even just build on that. Like in our world, we actually also pull that into how do we speak about our products, right? So we're not talking about, you know, the bits and connectors and the volume and how much horsepower it has, or we don't talk about that. We talk about the experiences. Like, so we build the brands around the experiences through to this location for us is our brand communications headquarters, right? So we've got multiple offices around the globe. This one does all of our brand comms for key moments for the brands. And their purpose is to tell those stories. And it is driven purely 100% about what is the experience that that product is giving that user in which moment. It's all experiential.
Yeah.
100%.
Yeah.
So I'd like to shift to the importance of connecting with the people who occupy these spaces rather than perhaps the professional designers or developers behind them. So Pascal, you've emphasized the disconnect between these professionals and the people occupying the space. Can you first elaborate a little bit more on this? And could you tell us about any contemporary examples of bad design for a community, or for any recent success stories, perhaps? Sometimes I think that exploring like
Nope,
bad
not touching that.
examples can be
Put that.
a little bit more illuminating.
Okay. It's a live stream, we say?
You can be vague if you'd like.
I will absolutely be vague, but I guess the project that I tend to like curse out the most, there's two projects that I definitely don't like, so that's gonna be obvious. Oh man, there's three. All right, well, you know what? I got lots of content for you.
Go on.
The first is, I would say, when we think about the audience and who we're designing for and how we try to design to be inclusive, there's also the audience that we don't want to engage and that we try to exclude from the process. And so one of the example projects that I typically talk about when I talk about architecture that can harm is Robert Moses and Jones Beach. And when he was designing Jones Beach, he didn't want the undesirables to go to this beautiful jewel that he was creating. And undesirables mean people of color, but immigrants. So if you weren't from here, you weren't welcome at his Jones Beach. So in his efforts in his work, he mandated that the overpass bridges on the Southern State Parkway be 9 feet or shorter, because he also understood that as immigrants or people of color, we use mass transit as our ways of getting from point A to B. So knowing that buses were that tall, by mandating these overpass bridges being that height, it excluded, and it was systematic and infrastructural perpetration of his racist ideals. So there's over 20 bridges on the Southern State Parkway that does that. So to me, that is a sense of architecture that is successful, as in it was designed and executed to push this ideal. With technology and time, obviously that broke that model, but to have that kind of power and to have that kind of information, to understand that there's absolute spaces where people walk in and don't feel like it is designed for them. And when we think about even interior spaces and proportions, that, I don't know about you, but women in workplace typically have sweaters at their desk because they're cold, because the temperature is set at the degree for a man with a vest and a jacket. So us in these dresses need an extra layer to accommodate. And we talk about the height proportions of chairs is designed for, you know, bodies that doesn't always look like ours. And so we also have to then accommodate. I'm so sorry. I don't know why I'm picking on you. We just like, never go Pascal. I have to say, there's moments where we have to contort our bodies to adjust into a space as well in those kind of aspects. But when we talk about designing successfully for community, is one that's accountable, right? For me, you can't. Success is managed, so it can be measured. To say I want sustainable, diverse projects, blah blah blah. Okay, but how? How well are you doing? How are you doing that? What metrics are you following? What rules are you subscribing to? And how do you know that it's even working? And then, therefore, once you know how it's performing, how do you refine? How do you innovate? How do you do even better? So I find a successful model of community engagement as it relates to architecture and design is one that doesn't just show up on community board meetings with some cold pizza and some flat soda, but those that allow for the community to participate regularly throughout the process and not volunteer their time, but they're compensated because they're bringing expertise and a local knowledge that we don't have access to in the design process. So finding meaningful ways of valuing the community that's sustained throughout all the phases and letting go of this idea of design being done only by professionals, but actually in collaboration with community, I think is a really cool and successful way of designing. Okay, last one though is
There was another.
the last one, and this one a little controversial, but it won't be surprising. I'm very anti building additional jails, prisons, and places of detention. We have way more than we need, and when we think about the private prison system and process, typically they have an 80% to 100% occupancy requirement. So while we're drawing and designing and constructing this structure, you have lobbyists that go and conform infractions that used to be a ticket or a fine into minimum days of in prison, which is literally manifesting architecture that is extracting bodies out of the community so that they are working on products and so on and so forth for cents on the dollar. So when we talk about
And it's all private structure.
and it's all private structure. So when you're in meetings and they're like, wow, if you can make that room just 1 more square foot bigger, we can double the occupancy. You realize that there's ways where you're designing for people in a way that is welcoming, but there's also ways that design can happen where it's extracting and it's harming and systematically perpetuating really horrible practices into the built environment. Okay, so I'm gonna stop talking now. And I'm sorry.
It's okay. We keep this room pretty warm over here. So it really didn't apply to me.
And did you have any response or comment?
I mean, I think the only thing I'd say is I also wear the hat at IF as the global head of sustainability and impact, and these stories matter a lot. I feel like I'm pretty well versed, and I've just learned a whole bunch of things. The Robert Moses is
Right?
actually
There's always
mind-blowing.
Every time.
about Robert Moses.
And I think as New Yorkers, we have one drink for offer in there, which is the Manhattan. It seems appropriate as the power plays. I don't know how many of you picked up on that. Again, I think that power, is actually, there are 2 words here. There's place and there's power. And I think what Pascal's pointing to that I think is important whenever any designer, and you're talking about inclusivity in your design as well, I think it's a topic that everyone is speaking to. It's both environmental inclusivity, it's social inclusivity, and as designers, we have a responsibility as an award, we have a responsibility to think further ahead about what we're doing, who we're including, and ergo also who we excluding, and what systems are being perpetuated, both on the environmental and social side. So my only add is, the responsibility. Dieter Rams showed up at age 92 on our stage in Berlin 2 weeks ago. The only thing that he said on that stage was, we have the responsibility as designers to make the world a better place. And I think, it's why I said yes to this opportunity to join IF. And I love being around designers because I think that's true.
Now, Kristen, you've described your work in the past as experience-centric and empathy-based. Could
Yep.
you elaborate on that?
The empathy-based part.
Yes.
So
Well, either part.
yeah, so I've been told that I overuse this by HR. By HR, I've been told that I overuse this. So I'll be careful, but it is a philosophy that I'm very, I really truly believe in at the deepest level. So first and foremost, I was a designer and I get to the opportunity to lead a group of designers. So inside our structure, everybody has a manager that has been a designer, that has delivered product, digital, physical, experiential, packaging, it doesn't matter.
but we all come from the world, every single one of us, of having understood what it means when you get a phone call at 4:30 on a Friday night and the whatever just hit the fan and you have to figure this out. It's a new problem that wasn't discovered 3 weeks ago, and you have to solve it before shovels start digging on Monday morning, right? Like before steel gets cut on Monday. So first and foremost, from an HR standpoint, empathy is a big part of our structure of how we have built the human organization, which is the design group globally inside Harman. As far as the design principle, we also built our user research team about that. I mean, it is not just ethnographics, but it is truly PhDs that know how to do proper real research on why are we doing this? Who are we doing it for? Bringing in the tools to just really dig deep in why should we care? And that sounds weird to say those words, but the care is what you're injecting. Like as a designer, that's what you're putting in. So why should you care? You need to know. You're not asking in the sense of arrogance, like, why should I care? You're asking, why should I care, right? That where's the comma or where's the emphasis is important here. So you understand why are we doing it? Naturally, that's there the empathy comes in, right? I mean, like every design field should, if they're not, should be doing that. And we lean hard on that. The designers lean hard on what they're telling them, and they're not allowed to stray from it. They're just not allowed to. So as a structure in our design process, you must represent that you are listening to the user. You are listening to them. And you look at the party box over here, it's a very different use scenario than making sure that the vehicle doesn't rear end the vehicle in front of you. And how do you do navigation on a heads-up display with an arrow, a magic carpet, or what we call a drone? So all of these pieces, you have to explain it. And that is an empathy-based wins that game every single time. And then as you get into brand communications, when we start articulating that story, and we were talking about this earlier, we believe that there's 1,000 micro decisions that happen by all the smartest people we know in this profession that we're working with. If we can harvest that, we can tell a more authentic story. So now we've brought empathy full circle to what you see on the side of a bus, what you see on the side of packaging, what you see in different places, you know, on the consumer side of the house. We tell an authentic story because we started at an authentic place, and that is empathy. Getting to know, why are we doing this? Why should we care?
I mean, I'm inspired by what you say because it activates how
You all got that? That was not in there.
I love it. It inspired me because it goes back to how we work at IJ Associates and the work that we're doing, that we also actually have a research team in the department. It's not a full group of architects who know how to Google, but actually researchers who study with philosophy backgrounds and understand how people are thinking. And part of that is, so when we get a project and a project site, we're not just understanding what's on the site now and what's across the street, but understanding historically what was once on the site, what was before there, and what were the significant historical moments that triggered a change in that built environment and the narrative that it carries. And that what happens on this site and how does it relate to that block, to that neighborhood, to that city, to that state, to that region, and really thinking about architecture and the work that we do really impacts everyone. And so even if we picked up the project and moved it 3 blocks over, that essentially should change the project design because it's responding to its context in a very different way, creating these bespoke moments. And so by doing those kind of ideas of research and about talking about why should we care, it's also understanding what are the cares of the community, which is why we talk about the community engagement. But then I'll take it to the next step for us is maybe making sure our team is diverse and creates that diversity of perspective, but then also are able to create and bring forward their different identities to create the level of empathy that creates knowledge sharing. So as a global office, we are 67% African American, African diaspora. In the New York office, we are 72%. And for a design architecture practice where we make up 2%, Black women make up 0.02% of the profession. African Americans in general make 2% altogether. So we are very, very rare. So to have a firm that also makes sure that our staff and our team is reflective of the ideas that we're talking about, that we have a diverse group of people that's part of the design process, that when we engage these communities, they are seeing themselves reflected. And it's not just creating a successful project together, but it's also exposing the process. So even if we don't inspire like half of them to come into architecture, we can at least inspire them to understand the power that they have in the design process so that they can be very intelligent and informed clients and collaborators in the future.
It's interesting as you were talking about the block, and we tend to work global, right? Like our block is the planet, and we have the exact same answer. We have diversity in where we are in each group, and it's not just about the technology. We're really doing the diversity on international geography based and bringing people and moving them around. We recently, last February, opened up a new studio in Amsterdam because we needed more international diversity in our consumer business. So we weren't touching enough, believe it or not, of the Northern European, right? So we had to pull more of that into our demographic to make sure that we were creating that global diversity. It's the same principle, just slightly different and applied to.
I'm gonna use a different example just from design and power place. So I had a senior role at Adidas when they bought a brown shoe company called Rockport. And Rockport was a global brand that was mostly a men's footwear brand. I know we have at least one footwear guy in the room. And shoes, for anyone who's ever gone shoe shopping, are really quite one of the most complex things I've ever dealt with. You can't imagine that. But you imagine that you buy that pair of Nikes anywhere in the world, right? I mean, that one particularly, I have a feeling actually is a special edition or whatever, but we're going to use it as an example, right? And the bottom line is that footwear is, okay, taste may be different, but actually fit based on cultural differences is not the same. And you have to build a size 8 or 9 or 10 in two widths, narrow and wide, that have to fit everyone everywhere, because that's how shoes get made if you are at a mass level. It is the most complex thing. So every time you guys put on your pair of shoes, do not underestimate how amazing it is that they fit. But I think of this also as a power of place, because our Asian markets versus our European markets versus our Latin American markets versus our American markets, preferences for fit, but also actually physiological as well as cultural habits of wearing are totally different. And you have to go in and build a team that understands how this happens. So I use that as a very simple example of how design in the power of place is not always about the experience of the senses, but also fit and feel.
The place in the shoe.
The place in the shoe.
And so I'd like to just discuss boring places. It's been found that spending time in a place that's boring can actually make us feel stressed. So
It's a New York thing.
so this can be from the context of a street or a building or a room. So I'd love to hear from your unique perspectives. What does it mean for a place to be interesting or boring? So this can involve maybe connections with nature, social spaces, visual complexity, or perhaps interactivity.
I can start if you want to. I mean,
You've been doing it all night.
She's just on a roll because you're so fun to pick on.
We exist to make sure that no space is boring. It's like literally, we exist to make sure that spaces are not boring. Both of us.
Right.
Like you design the space for a purpose. So boring is literally the opposite, right? I mean, libraries are quiet, but they're never boring, right? Like a boring place means that design has probably not been there in a while. If you look at office spaces that everybody looks at and laughs and oh my gosh, and references a movie from the whatever that was, the 80s, 90s, right? It's because it's boring and design hasn't been there. So I think that boring spaces like we exist to not let boring spaces exist.
Inspired.
Short, sweet.
That was good. +1.
I got a big hole to dig out of somehow.
+2.
Okay, so
Last question.
last question.
No, you got to talk about boring spaces.
Is there another answer that could possibly top that one?
Design is missing.
Design is missing.
Hasn't been there in a while.
Yeah. Okay.
I actually was struggling to kind of think about what would be a boring space, because even in a space
don't-
where the style clashes with my aesthetic, it's still
Not boring.
something to learn from and something to digest. So I was trying to figure out what is actually boring, and being a very animated person, I don't know that I get bored very easily. So I actually found your kind of connection to the idea of when design or focus of design was last out of spaces, what makes it boring, because it wasn't considering a lot of the senses and the stuff that we are interacting that activate us in those ways. So I truly plus one, no, plus two.
Yeah.
Good.
So back,
I'm a designer. I don't know how to do math.
back to the meaning of placemaking. What does it mean to create a sense of belonging through architecture or design? So Christian, how does your audio solution enhance the sense of belonging and scale of experience, whether it's personal and intimate or large and impactful, across various environments and purposes?
How do we make it purposeful?
Yeah, so what does it mean to create a sense of belonging?
Got it. Sense of belonging. The answer to that is going to be making it personal, right? So I've talked about this a little bit, in each part. An experience needs to be personal. We talked about the empathy. That's where we draw that to authentic. Making it purposeful. Why are you there? And why are you in that vehicle? You're going somewhere. You need to get there safe. You are in Madison Square Garden. You're in the Grand Mosque, right? You are there for two very different purposes in these very large places. We need to bring that purpose, and we need to articulate it and let individuals express themselves however they need to do it. It might be very quiet, right? I mean, when you think about religious environments, the audio needs to be tailored to a very unique and specific way, because people are there to find something in themselves, not to be entertained by something, right? So we have to think about that as we're designing those pieces, and that goes into the user interface. It goes into the hardware selection. It goes into the actual, how does it hide in the ceiling? That purpose is just always bespoke. It's always custom, because you're in that moment, and what you're doing at that time, that's it. And we were just last week up in Montreal with the consumer team, and we were releasing some new products internally. And one of the big things that the design team was showing was how one of our products today that lives in one purpose could evolve into multiple purposes. It's a different lens that we're also looking at of how do products, I don't want to say act as a chameleon, but kind of adapt to the world that they're in at that time. And again, changing their purpose.
So Pascal, this might relate to designing for communities, creating a sense of belonging. So often it's the so-called sidewalk life that can create a good community, to bring up Jane Jacobs. But how can an architect help people feel welcome in a space, in a community?
I appreciate the sidewalk component, because we talked about belonging. I think about septet principles, and I don't know if some of you are familiar with it. It's crime prevention through environmental design, and it was set up in a way to, I don't know, prevent crime, but it created a way of actually a mindset where your unknown familiar person on that sidewalk, if you don't know them, then they're a threat, right? And so it talked about creating large windows in the front of your house so that you can observe who is on the sidewalk. It's about making sure you put the parameters of your fence so that it's clear what your property is versus what's public space. It talks about sight lines for security cameras, but it sets up this thought process that if you don't know or find this person familiar, then there's an issue there. And it created this systematic way of thinking that there's people who belong and don't belong in a space, i.e. Trayvon Martin, right? So when we think about when we're walking in spaces, places where people presume for us not to be welcome, then there's a series of fear that is then activated. So when we talk about architecture and the way, the principles in which we use to design, is actually the possibilities of creating spaces where community can happen, where community can grow and to flourish. And so therefore it becomes a sense of space, because, or a sense of community and belonging, because it's saying everyone is welcome in this space, so that you can create your own natural connections, rather than saying this is my space, you're too close, or you're two parts to my space where you're encroaching. And so this idea of individualism through architecture, I challenge and think about what are some spaces that we can create that allows for people to kind of come together. And when you start creating and changing laws where police can now interact or intervene when there's a sense of a threshold of property, then that also starts to perpetuate those ideas, right? And so we got to think about what are the policies and what are the built environment components that emphasize certain messages, and understand that the way we absorb and communicate through those messages might be very different for one person versus another. What could be a message of belonging to one person could be completely out of reach for another. And so that goes back to the empathy building, and that goes back to the diversity and understanding culturally what is the right fit. It's all the things that we need to keep in mind, because we want to make sure that we're creating a space that has all those elements that allows each person to see a little bit of their identity there, so that they get a sense of belonging.
It's interesting because in the luxury sector, it's so, I mean, just to use consumer goods as an example, or even like food, right? Consumer packaged goods, there's a creation of price tiering, right? Of brands on this level of like, who is it for? And they're, you know, and what does accessibility look like? And what does inclusivity look like? And what is belonging? And which is my brand? Am I a Coke person? Am I a Pepsi person? Right? Am I a diet? Right? I neither. I haven't touched soda for 20 years. So wine, please. But no, I think these are really interesting questions that actually, again, coming to the design as a holistic perspective, or art. What is accessibility? What is belonging? What is community? And they're different tastes. And you have to understand, first and foremost, as a brand builder, I think we have a couple brand comms people in the room, and you have to understand who you're speaking to. You have to make sure to have that conversation ahead of time, so you're not telling them what they're supposed to feel, but again, coming back to the empathy, but that they actually feel that. And I mean, that's true in architecture because it stays for so long. I think it's even more important. And as you say, history and future.
I mean, I thought about, as you talked about it, I thought about the ADA Act, which is the American Disability Act, which to me was this phenomenal, incredible advocacy moment where there's a community, a group that says, hey, architects, I love how shiny and polished your buildings are, but I don't feel included. I have a hard time engaging or having access to. And architects was like, no, we're trying to make it taller and taller and taller. We can't kind of like listen to you or design for you. And so there was a protest where those in that community kind of came up to City Hall and literally climbed up on their forearms and elbows up the stairs to be the visual representation of how inaccessible the built environment is for them. And that allowed for the law to pass. So now architects, we don't have a choice. We have to design for ADA compliance. And I love this because if we have these tools, these design kits, that we are not leveraging the community that requires it and asks of it nicely, I absolutely excited that they do it. I actually cheer them on that they do it, and they go advocate in a way that they make it systematic that we have to. And so now we have these wonderful ramps that it's not just for those who have mobile disabilities, but all sorts of different people that are actually using them and leveraging them. So when we talk about architecture that is responsive to the community, it's also understanding that there's ways that we design. Again, it could be a beautiful polished building, but if there's 20,000 steps to get into it, you have to understand that you have already started to pull apart who can actually enjoy these pieces of architecture in these places. So when we talk about places of belonging, it's also thinking about that their experience is equal to and not less than somebody else's. The ramp is right to the stage, not to the back, to the behind and around past the trash chute, and then can come into the building, but has a beautiful entry sequence that allows a person with a baby carriage, a person with crutches, a person with a wheelchair, and a person that's just has a problem with their hip to be able to come into a space and not feel that physical component or characteristic is amplified and or triggered in a negative way in the spaces that they're engaging.
It also opens up other things, like this is the ADA ramp over here, and it allows the stage people to come in, which means they can hire anyone, right? So it's not just ADA letting people in the building.
That's right.
It's also ADA ensuring that anybody can have any job and can do anything. I mean, I was just, as you're saying, I'm looking at it. I was part of the design of this space, and we lost 3 feet over there, and it was a discussion, and like, of course, right, you don't have a choice, but it's the right thing, and you work with it. Today, the stage crew shows up, right? And what are they rolling everything up? As you're saying it, it means that anybody can be part of the stage crew. So it compounds on itself. It's not just that single piece in that moment.
And I really appreciate you telling that story because sometimes we take for granted now about ADA regulations. Like, I think that young people now are so used to it, and it's easy to forget why this is in place in the beginning. So with that, I think that we can end and open up for questions from the audience. I know